Im ola korbono min haboker. If it's a burnt offering, if the korban, the sacrifice is an ola min haboker, he brings it from the boker. That's from the. We spoke about the sheep, the goat, and the bull, the cow. Those are the species. Zocha tomim. Yakriveno. It must be a male, unblemished. El Pesachol Moed Yakriv Osel Utzol Lifnei Hashem. So let's see what all these details are. Zohar V'lo Nikevo. Tobim V'lo Mum. Has to be unblemished. So over here, the Seferno says you could have an animal which is a prize animal in terms of the way it looks, in terms of its monetary worth, but it's not perfect, it has a blemish. And you could have an emaciated cow in terms doesn't have much flesh on it, but it has no blemish. The cow which is emaciated, unblemished, qualifies as a korban, and the other cow, which has a more attractive appearance and monetarily worth more, doesn't qualify to be the korban because it's not tomim, because it's not unblemished. Tomim is perfect, without blemish. We find that Dover Mel says that Torah Hashem Timima, right? The Torah Hashem is Timima. Timima means it's perfect. It's perfect in its state, it's perfect. The animal has to be, whatever an animal is meant to be, it has to be perfect in its physical form. Being blemished means there's a defect. It's become defective. It has to be whole in what it's meant to be. Defective, it's not. Now, the question is, what does Tomim represent? Whole, complete. Now, it's interesting. We find, just came to mind this moment, that at the time of creation, it says God created, whether it's vegetation, whether it's species, it says limino. Every species of plant, every planting, every seed, the Torah says limino, according to its species. And animals also limino, according to its species. And as a result of that, you're not permitted to crossbreed crops. You're not permitted to crossbreed animals. It's a Torah violation. It has to be limino. Why? Because when God created existence, it was created with a specific profile, infrastructure. You must maintain that. If you go and you crossbreed, and it's no longer that original profile of creation, that's a Torah violation. To create a new entity which didn't exist at the time of creation. God created this. Altering that it should be something other than that, it doesn't qualify. When you bring the animal to God, it has to be as in its perfect state as he created it. God created a perfect animal. If it's blemished, it's called deficient. Therefore, it's not appropriate. It's not relevant what its financial cost is. It's the profile. What is it? It's not in its perfect state. That seemingly maybe that's the understanding. Or perfect. It has to be perfect. Anything that has to do with God, as God is perfect on the absolute level, in the physical level, anything that has to do with God, it has to be within the context of physicality, it has to be perfect. If it's not perfect, it doesn't qualify. Because it's not appropriate. There's an expression, the commentaries cite that we find that Yosef, when he was taken out of the dungeon, it says he was groomed. They cut his hair, he was groomed, and they gave him a change of clothing when he came before Paro. So over there, the Sephora says, cites a pasuk from Megillah. Megillah says there, "Ein boyin live shara melech levush sok." One doesn't come to the gate of the king with sackcloth. When Esther sent him another suit of clothing, because Mordechai was wearing sackcloth because he was aware of the decree to annihilate every man, woman, and child. So she sent him another suit of clothing because ein lovo b'shara melech levush sok. You don't come to the gate of the king in sackcloth. That's why Yosef, when they took him out of the dungeon, they groomed him, they cut his hair, and they gave him a new suit of clothing. Because to come in prisoner's garb to the king, it's not appropriate. The Kohen who's blemished, he stands before God. That's levush sok. It's an inappropriate stance. The animal that you bring to God has to be perfect. It's not perfect. It's inappropriate. The Gemara tells us in Yuma that if there was a vessel in the base of Mikdash that was damaged, they would never repair it. Whenever something, let's say, wore out or was broken, they fashioned a new vessel. They never used the vessel that was fixed. Why? Because ein aniyus b'mokum ashirus. A person who can't afford to replace it, you're always fixing and tinkering to try to restore it. When the king's table, everything is perfect. There's no such thing as being fixed. That's aniyus b'mokum ashirus. A poor man in a location where you demonstrate the ultimate level of wealth, there's no indication to any degree that there's impoverishment here. A poor person fixes things. A king doesn't fix things. Everything's replaced. That's malchus. That's kingship. That's royalty. You come before God, it has to be in a royal state. Royalty means perfect. Anything less than perfect is inappropriate. As a result of that, since the korban is brought in Lifnei Hashem, therefore it has to be in that perfect state. If it's blemished, it's inappropriate for that reason. Okay. The Samach Yodo al Rosha Olo. He puts his hands on the head of the Olo. So the Gemara explains that a person takes both hands, although it says Yodo, the Ramban speaks over here. Smicha, when you lean with both hands and you put your full weight behind the head of it doesn't mean on its head, it means right at where the head connects with the body, and you put your weight and weigh down on the animal. And this is how when he says the confession. When he does the confession, as we discussed yesterday, because without vidui, without verbal confession, it doesn't bring about kapara, there's no atonement. So he weighs down on the animal and he says his confession. And then it's accepted, it's favored to bring about kapara. But he has to weigh down now. The Gemara says this is the way we rule, that a woman does not do smicha. Why? Because the Gemara cites a verse, it says B'nai Yisrael v'lo b'nos Yisrael. It's an exclusion. Only the men put their weight way down on it. However, the Gemara says something interesting. For whatever reason, the women do, but they don't put their full weight on it. They just put their hands on the animal. It has a semblance of smicha. What is the concept? What is the significance of smicha? When you weigh down on the animal. So yesterday, based on what we said in the name of the Talmud Dvorah and the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, when you bring an animal, why does the animal atone? And you can only bring the animal, it's shogeg, not deliberate, because when a person sins, you create a certain negative force. And the only way that negative force can be taken off the person is it's transferred onto the animal, onto the korban. And you sacrifice the animal, you slaughter it, but sprinkle its blood, that negative force is actually vaporized when it's brought Lashem. But that's only if it's shogeg, not mazid. Because we said if it's mazid, it creates such a intense negative force. You actually putrefy the animal, therefore the animal can't be brought in mizbeach for that reason. It's not appropriate. Shogeg, it's a negative force, but it doesn't putrefy the animal. So when you put your hands on the animal, that's the transfer. You do the tshuva, the verbal confession, in your heart, you have remorse, you commit yourself to the future and you verbalize it, and you weigh down on the animal. So that weighing down is the transfer of that force from the person onto the animal. That's the concept of smicha, according to what we said yesterday. However, Rabbeinu Bachya says something else. He explains it differently. He says it's very interesting. He says that a person is comprised of three parts. We're made of three things. You have the nefesh. What is the nefesh? The nefesh is the physicality of the person. That's the life source. And then you have the ruach, you have the spirit, and then you have the neshama. The neshama, the soul. That's the components that a person is comprised of. Nefesh, ruach, neshama. When a person sins, now he explains, Rav Chaim Volozhin discusses this in his commentary on Pirkei Avos, that every living creature has a nefesh. Because what's nefesh? Nefesh, in his words, is koach hatinua. That there's movement, that you're able to move, that is life source in every living creature. Its life source allows it to function as it functions. An animal, an insect, a reptile doesn't have a spirit, doesn't have a ruach, does not have a neshama. But every species has its own nefesh, which allows it to manifest itself to be whatever it is, whether it's the lion, whatever species it is. Then the ruach. What is the ruach? The ruach is spirit. The ruach literally means wind. That's speech. When you speak, the human being has a ruach. Because when we verbalize things, air comes out of our mouths. That's ruach. That's what's called ruach. Neshama is what? Is a spiritual entity. That's the thought process. The intellect that we're able to comprehend and process things and have understanding at many levels to extrapolate, that's neshama. That emanates from the soul. Okay? So, just a little bit to give you an understanding, Rav Chaim Volozhin explains, just as a human being has a nefesh, ruach, and neshama, Klal Yisrael has also, there's the nefesh of Klal Yisrael, there's the ruach of Klal Yisrael, and there's the neshama of Klal Yisrael. Each one of the patriarchs perfected another aspect of one of these three components. Avraham Avinu was chesed. Avraham Avinu perfected and spiritualized the nefesh of Klal Yisrael. What's nefesh? When you do chesed, you go out to do for others. That's hospitality. And like it says, when he saw the angels, it's Vayoratz Avram l'karosum. Avram ran towards them. He ran towards them. He prepared. He hurried. He rushed. That's nefesh. Yitzchak corresponds to the neshama. Why does he correspond to the neshama? Because Yitzchak was the unblemished offering that was brought at Tamid the Kedah. And if a Kohen has an impure thought, when he brings the korban is invalidated. So Yitzchak represents that pure thought. Yitzchak is the neshama. Yaakov is Yaakov Ishtam Yeshivolim. Yaakov represents the ruach. That's the study of Torah. The Gemara tells us in Eruvin, which we discussed many times, that when you study Torah, you must verbalize it. Because it says in the Pasuk, quotes the Pasuk, Chaim hi lemotzoehim. Literally means it brings life to those who come upon it. So the Gemara says, Chaim hi lemotzi bepeh. It brings life if you articulate it with your mouth. That's when it takes on its fullest degree of value. It has to be verbalized. Yaakov is Torah. He personifies Torah. So he's Ruach, Yaakov. So Avram perfected the nefesh of Klal Yisrael, Yitzchak the neshama, and Yaakov the Ruach. Okay, that's Rav Chaim Voloshin in Pirkei Avos. There's Rav Chaim HaKadosh elsewhere who says that what is the objective of a person in life? The nefesh is physical. It's to spiritualize the nefesh, to upgrade it to the level of ruach. Ruach is a higher level. The objective is to take the ruach, which is the power of speech, and upgrade it to the level of neshama. So how does one upgrade the nefesh to ruach? By investing your physicality in doing mitzvahs. We say asher kidshonu b'mitzvosav, right? When we do mitzvahs, we use our physicality to actualize mitzvahs. We spiritualize it. So you're taking the mundane nefesh, which is the physicality of the person, and you elevate it to the next level. When you take the power of speech, which every human being speaks, and you invest it in Torah, you spiritualize that faculty, which is ruach, and you elevate it to neshama. And when you take the neshama and you comprehend the Torah thoughts, which are spiritual thoughts, you elevate the neshama. It's called nishmasa the neshama. You elevate it to a level the neshama has relevance in this world. You elevate it that even though it's in this world, you elevate it to bring it to a higher level in its root, the root of it, which is in the spiritual world. Those are the words of the Rav Chaim HaKadosh. So the objective of life is to take each component and through your initiative, elevate it to the next level. That's the Rav Chaim HaKadosh. So over here, Rabbeinu Bachya says, when a person sins, we sin with what? With our faculty. Whatever we do. So our physicality is involved. Usually before a person sins, usually there's some level of, when you think about something, we speak. You're about to do something. A person murmurs to himself. So usually the power of speech is involved. And when you actually commit the crime, or before you actualize, you're actualizing what you plan to do. There's the third thought process. So when you sin, all three components are engaged in sin. The physicality, the speech, and the mind. As a result of that, each one was diminished due to the sin. The act of the sin, speaking about the sin to whatever degree, and thinking about it, planning it and actualize it, bring it to fruition. As a result of that, each one of the components has to be corrected. How do you correct it? When you lean on the animal, that's the action. And that's what you lean on with all your weight. That corresponds to the action that you have done. When you do the confession, the vidui, that corresponds to the power, to the speech. That corrects the speech that was actually damaged through being associated with sin. And when you burn the innards, which includes the kidneys have relevance to chokhmah, that atones for what? For the deficiency in the mind. That the mind, the thought process was utilized to contemplate and plan sin. That's Rabbeinu Bachya. Over here. The Rabbeinu Bachya doesn't mention nefesh, ruach, neshama. I'm only mentioning the others. He says it's simple. Action, speech, thought. I'm just saying it corresponds to what? To the nefesh, to the ruach, and to the neshama. So I took it, explained it again. We find the three segments of Klal Yisrael. There's Yisrael, there's the Levi, and there's the Kohen. Right? The most advanced level is what? Is the Kohen. Then the Levi is the next level, and the lowest level is the ordinary Jew, Yisrael. The Jew is the Nefesh. That's the most ordinary level. What is the Levi's function in the Beis Hamikdash? Song. Sings. Shira. What is the Kohen? The Kohen officiates, that's the thought. He has to have that pure thought when he brings the korban on behalf of the Jew. The Jew brings the carbon. The Levi accompanies the carbon with Shira, the service. That's words. That's the power of speech. And the Kohen is the mind. He has to have that pure thought when he actually does the service. So I wanted to say, you find the Gemara tells us in Tainus, there were three leaders that we were gifted with: Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. If you grade them, Moshe was the greatest of the three. Aaron was next to the greatest. Miriam was the least of the three. Moshe, Aaron, Miriam. Now, the Gemara says we had three gifts in the Midbar. What were they? We had the bear, we had the wellspring that traveled with us for 40 years. The bear is called Bear Shel Miriam. That was the merit of Miriam. The Anei Kavod, the clouds of glory, were in the merit of Aaron, the Kohen. And the Mun was in the merit of Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's when Miriam passed away, what happened? The wellspring stopped. When Aaron passed away, the clouds of glory were dispersed. So it says when Miriam passed away, it stopped. Why was the bear reinstated? It was the merit of Moshe. So Moshe now, the Mun and the bear was in place. When Aaron passed away, the clouds of glory were dispersed. It was reinstated in the merit of Moshe. At the end, all three were Moshe Rabbeinu. But initially, each one came about, Miriam, Aaron, and Moshe. Now, what is a bear? What's the difference between a bear? A bear is what? Is a living wellspring. It's not a cistern. It's not stagnant water. It's churning. It's always being regenerated. New water keeps coming. That's what a bear is. What is bear? That's movement. Miriam, it represents the nefesh of Klal Yisrael. Aaron, it's clouds. What's clouds? Clouds of glory. That's ruach. What is the mun? The Ramban says the mun. The Gemara in Yuma says the mun is called lechem abirim. It's the food. It's the bread of the powerful ones. Now, how do the Malachim? What sustains the Malachim? Quoting the Gemara, the Malachim are sustained. What is their infusion that allows them to exist? Then in Miziv Hashchina, they benefit from the radiance of God. That's what maintains the Malachim. The Mun was spiritual food, even though it was turned into a physical object, but its innate value was purely spiritual. We ingested it, and there was no waste. It was absorbed in our inner organs. The Gemara tells us in the Medrash, "Lo nidna Torah le'ochle man." When we ate the mun, we became spiritualized when we ingested that mun. That itself was Ziv Hashchina, which was turned into a physical entity, so the physical being should be able to eat it and be nourished by it. But it's the same nourishment which nourishes the Malachim. That's the Shechin itself. So Moshe Rabbeinu representing the soul of Klal Yisrael. He's the highest level. In his merit, we had the Mun. The Mun itself represents the Shechina, which is converted into a physical form. Aaron represents the Ruach of Klal Yisrael. Therefore, in his merit, he had the clouds of glory. Miriam, who represents the Nefesh of Klal Yisrael, which is movement, in her merit, we had the bear, Shel Miriam. Therefore, there's the churning water, which continuously churned new water. There was an ongoing source of water for 40 years. That's just the takeoff of this, the smicha, the vidui, and the actually burning the innards of the animal. Or Chaim asks a question. God created the world with mishpat. There has to be some degree of justice. Equitable evaluation. A person sins and he deserves to die. As we said, the korban, as the Ramban says, when a person brings the animal that qualifies as the sacrifice, what does he have to have in mind? that in reality, because of the sin, the only way he could be rehabilitated, he has to be slaughtered, his blood has to be sprinkled, and he has to be burnt. As we explained, that because when that impure force attaches itself to you, the only way you're able to vaporize it, it's only if you go through this process. Because we're saying, in actual, that's what happens. It goes on to the korban, and when you do the confession and you do the smicha, you lean on it, it passes on to it, and when you bring that, and it's done with the proper procedure, which is done by the Kohen, then the person has full rehabilitation. Otherwise, there's an attachment because that impure force and the person himself. But if that's the case, if it's mishpat, you sin, you do the wrong thing, why should the animal pay the price? Mishpat says you should pay the price. So we say because it's korban lashem, that's midas rachmim. But how do we reconcile rachmim with taking the life of an animal? Right? How do you reconcile the two? That's the question Orach Chaim HaKodesh asks. So he explains, Gemara tells us that when a person sins, a person only sins when he has a certain degree of foolishness. It's a lack of cognizance. If you would have been more aware and more focused, it wouldn't have happened. So if a person would actually utilize his full human faculties and exercise restraint, which has to do with the focus, you wouldn't have sinned. So why does a person sin? Because he did not employ his intellect and his ability to take control. So what was his behavior? You were a person who functioned without the intellect. What is that? You function as a physical being. That's an animal. Now, when you bring the korban, what is a korban? You've come to the realization of you made a mistake, and you do tshuva. When you do tshuva, now who are you? You're no longer the animal. By coming to terms with the wrong you had done, and as a result that you have remorse and make a commitment, now you're being restated as the Adam. You're Adam now. You don't take an Adam for the behavior of an animal. As a result of that, Hashem says that if you want to have an understanding that, therefore, we can't take your life because you're an elevated species. You're not the animal. The one who committed the crime, you're not that person. You're not that entity. Therefore, Midas Rachmim says we take the animal, which is the possession of the sinner, in the place of the person for the animal act, which he's no longer that animal. Therefore, it's equitable. But that's Rachmim. Midas Adin says you should be the korban. Midas Rachmim says within the context of Mishpat, it's not right and correct to take you because you're Adam. So we take the animal for the act of the animal, which was your initial act before you were restored to the Adam. That's the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. That's the understanding. So therefore, that concept we're speaking now, that you're Adam, what makes you Adam, what makes you not Adam, without Torah, you have no understanding. With two opposite ends of the spectrum, either you're this or you're that. Midas Adin says you have to be perfect. You have to behave always like the Adam. You fall off the cliff, you're off. Chesed says that's purely physicality. To be Adam, you need the Torah. When did we become Adam? When we give him the Torah at Sinai, that's when we became Adam. Atem Kriyim Adam. Because that spiritualizes the person. That creates the link between the nefesh and the neshama. That's the ruach. That's the Torah itself. Okay?